The Great Barrier Reef is located just off the coast of Queensland, Australia. Its area is 344,400 square miles, according to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. It's essentially its own country. It has over 600 types of sea life, flora, and fauna, and it's the largest reef in the world. The Great Barrier Reef is an economic powerhouse for the Australians. The Great Barrier Reef has been around for many years, but in previous years, its quality of life has declined. Among the many organisms that live in the Great Barrier Reef, coral is a major one. The Great Barrier Reef has over 3,000 types of coral. Since 2016, over half the coral has died. According to the National Ocean Service, a majority of coral has died from coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is when coral has high stress levels and it causes the algae on the coral to leave. And since algae and coral depend on each other to survive, when the algae leaves, the coral becomes white and vulnerable, which usually ends up in it dying. And some ways that coral bleaching happens is when the tides are extremely low and it causes too much sun exposure, change in temperature, and pollution. Some other ways that coral dies is from human touch and sunscreen. So we have natural oils on our fingers, and since coral is very sensitive, it's a very sensitive animal, which is a common misconception about coral because many people think it's an plant, but it's actually an animal and it lives and breathes too. And the natural oils on our fingers are very harmful to them and can make their stress levels skyrocket, causing them to spread the stress because once one is stressed, the one surrounding it will be stressed too, and so on and so on. So just by gently grazing one, you could cause an entire colony to die off. And the way sunscreen kills them is because non-biodegradable sunscreen has one ingredient called oxybenzone that is highly lethal to all sea life. And the way you can check to see if your sunscreen has it or not is it usually will say biodegradable in the front, or in the back if you look, it says an active ingredients, or either underneath it'll say, this one says free of ingredients identified to have potential adverse impacts to coral reefs. So this one would be perfect. It's Alba Botanica. And ones like Equate and Coppertone have oxybenzone, so you shouldn't use those when you go to the ocean. And I know in some parts, like when I went to Mexico and we swam with dolphins, they had their own sunscreen because I guess in past people would say, oh yeah, it's biodegradable, but then it wouldn't be, and the dolphins would get really sick afterwards. So they had their own that you could use to ensure that it was biodegradable. With all these plants and animals that live together in harmony, it would be surprising if the Great Barrier Reef wasn't huge, and that's why it's such a great candidate for all these animals to live together, because it's so spacious. The Great Barrier Reef is bigger than some countries actually. The United Kingdom, Poland, and Switzerland combined is smaller than the Great Barrier Reef, but the Great Barrier Reef is only half the size of Texas. And Jay Holden said that just puts into perspective how giant Texas is, but how massive that Great Barrier Reef is. And with its size and how many sea creatures live there, it takes many hands to be on deck to keep up with the maintenance and the conservation of the Great Barrier Reef, and to maintain a safe and healthy habitat. And according to Seek, where you can find jobs in the surrounding area. You can be a marine biologist, a tour guide, a GPA, a boat crew, and just maintenance in general. They have some foundations, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, where they go and they clean up the beach. The Great Barrier Reef is its own ecosystem, but it greatly helps out with the rest of the planet too. The ocean creates over 80,000% of the Earth's oxygen. The Great Barrier Reef is a great producer of the Earth's oxygen, or the ocean's oxygen actually. It creates over 20% of the ocean's oxygen and 40% of the Earth's oxygen. So without the Great Barrier Reef, the air quality would decrease immensely.